Pardon me if my voice sounds gross, I'm sick at the moment. Godzilla Minus One is an absolute masterpiece of a film. As someone who's grown up a massive Godzilla fan, I will always look for the positives in each and every one of his films. That's not to say I love them all, because I don't, but I will always watch them. And when I tell you that this film is my favorite, not just that I've watched this year, but maybe even within all of this entire franchise, I mean it when I say it is truly a masterpiece. For those unfamiliar with the character, you can usually break them up into two basic categories: fun action monster flicks and serious world-ending catastrophes. This movie is the latter. It harkens back to the days of Godzilla being this absolute tank of a monster wreaking havoc on the people of Japan, and the humans caught in the crossfire. Minus One is almost a spiritual remake of the very first Godzilla film that was released all the way back in 1954. That first movie is dark, and I mean really dark. It's not a fun watch. It's depressing, it's heartbreaking, the tone is really just abysmal. It does kind of have a happy ending, with Godzilla dying, but not really, because he just comes back for future sequels. Minus One is very similar in tone to that first movie. The main character here is an ex-World War II kamikaze pilot that faked a plane problem to avoid dying in the war, only to almost die when a dinosaur attacks Odo Island, leaving everyone but our main character and another dead. He returns home only to be harassed by his neighbor and community for not doing his part as the pilot. He also suffers from your typical war PTSD and survivor's guilt from the Godzilla's earlier attack. Now, I don't just want to recap the movie's plot here, partially because that's boring, and partially because I think you should watch it yourself. But I do want to point something out. The 1954 film is, at least was, my favorite Godzilla movie, mostly because it does such a good job showing you just how much of a threat Godzilla really was. This movie does the same thing, just with modern cinema techniques and CGI. Speaking of CGI, Godzilla himself looks phenomenal here. Toho's last Godzilla film, Shin Godzilla, that came out in 2014, also looked good, but this one is even a step above that. Without knowing that this is a movie, I wouldn't have known Godzilla wasn't actually there. Well, except for one scene. No, I just mentioned Shin Godzilla. Compared to Minus One, it is a more divisive entry in the franchise. A lot of people didn't particularly enjoy it, me included, and that's really just for one major reason. They changed his origin. In Shin Godzilla, he went through multiple stages of evolution before he got to the main Godzilla, and each of them looked really dumb, and it just pulled me out of the movie. While Minus One does carry some of that idea over, it dials it way back. The first attack on Odo Island that I mentioned is the only time Godzilla looks more computer-generated. Coincidentally, it's also the only sequence that features a smaller, more T-Rex-esque design for the titular monster. He's smaller, so he moves faster, but it also looks more rubbery. It's not as distractingly different from the main Godzilla as this thing was, but it's different enough to fall into the uncanny valley, at least for me. Anyway, nitpicking aside, this film is phenomenal. The acting is fantastic from everyone, especially from Kamigi, the main character. I hope I said that right. The action is top-notch, the story really tugs at your heartstrings, the VFX are fantastic, and the tone, while depressing at times, fits perfectly with the time period and story that this movie is trying to tell. Unlike most Godzilla films, I wasn't squirming in my seat for Godzilla to show back up. The human characters really carry this movie. I'm really invested in their storyline, and I think that is part of why this movie is such a masterpiece, because the monster parts that Godzilla is in, they look phenomenal and they're super badass, but you almost don't want to see that happen because you care so much about these humans that you don't want their lives to be affected too. It's a perfect dichotomy. Ultimately, that's why I think this Godzilla film, over all of the other ones, maybe besides the first one, is the best in the franchise. And if you haven't seen it, I highly, highly, highly recommend you give it a chance. Even if you're not a Godzilla fan, I think there's a lot here that you can appreciate, even just from a basic storytelling perspective. Overall, by far, best movie I've seen in the year, and Godzilla -1 gets a 10 out of 10 from me.